The British government cancelled the operation. December 17, 2004, Fallujah, Iraq. A journalist from the United Kingdom and his Iraqi interpreter had been kidnapped by a group connected to the Zarqawi network, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq organization that had been conducting hostage-taking operations, videotaped executions, and suicide bombings across the country. The journalist's capture had been reported in the Arabic media. The family had been contacted with ransom demands. The British Foreign Office was aware, the American military was aware, and somewhere inside the classified reporting from Iraq, someone had identified the building, a specific location, a street in the Shuhada district, a facility where the two hostages were being held. At noon on December 17th, the British government made a decision. The operation to rescue the journalist and his interpreter was cancelled. The cancellation came from the cabinet level. The reason was intelligence that suggested the hostages might have been moved, and if the SAS raided the wrong building, it would embarrass the British government in front of the Americans and destabilize something called the special relationship, at a moment when the UK was trying to navigate a complicated diplomatic situation in Iraq. The order was transmitted down the chain, and somewhere in the operations chain, a 12-man troop from an organization called Task Force Black, the SAS's direct action element working inside Iraq, received the cancellation message and made a decision that would make the cabinet's decision obsolete. The Task Force Black was the official designation for the SAS operations element in Iraq. It had been established in 2003 as the initial phases of the Iraq War were transitioning into a sustained counterinsurgency campaign against an increasingly organized insurgent network. The organization of Task Force Black was different from standard SAS operation structures. It was established specifically for operations against what would eventually be called the Zarqawi network, the Al-Qaeda in Iraq organization led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, which had declared war on everything that was not aligned with its extremist vision. The network's tactics were brutal: suicide bombings, public executions, hostage-takings, assassination of governmental officials and security force members. The network had declared that it would kill foreign nationals, that it would kill Iraqis who worked with the coalition, that it would kill Iraqis who were not sufficiently committed to the Islamic State vision. Task Force Black's role was direct action, capturing or killing key insurgent leaders, preventing high-profile terrorist attacks before they occurred, pursuing the Zarqawi network specifically, and conducting hostage rescue operations when the intelligence was good enough to justify the risk. By December 2004, Task Force Black had been operating for 18 months. The organization had conducted hundreds of operations. They had killed or captured dozens of significant insurgent leaders. They had become, arguably, the most effective counterinsurgency element operating in Iraq at that time. The team worked under conditions of extreme secrecy. Their bases were not on regular military installations. Their movements were not announced. Their operations were not reported in the press or in conventional military channels. They were a classified unit operating classified missions under rules of engagement that were themselves not subject to public review. The kidnapping of the British journalist had created a specific kind of pressure that cascaded through multiple institutions. The journalist was a public figure in the United Kingdom. He was known. He had a family. The family was communicating with the media. British newspapers were running stories about the kidnapping. The government was under pressure to demonstrate that it was doing something, that it was not passively allowing one of its citizens to be murdered. And Task Force Black had been tasked with doing something. They had been given an intelligence picture that supposedly showed where the journalist was being held. The intelligence came from multiple sources, as intelligence about anything in Iraq did at that time. There was signals intelligence, monitored communications between the captors discussing logistics, discussing hostage conditions, discussing negotiations or ransom demands. There was human intelligence, people reporting what they'd seen or heard, people inside the insurgent network, people with access to safe house networks. There was imagery intelligence, satellite photographs or aerial reconnaissance that had identified specific buildings, specific vehicles, specific patterns of activity consistent with hostage-holding operations. There was pattern analysis, looking at the Zarqawi network's known safe houses and determining which locations fit the pattern of being used as hostage locations. When all of this intelligence was integrated and analyzed by professional intelligence officers, it pointed to a specific building on a specific street in the Shuhada district of Fallujah. Task Force Black had been given the intelligence and had been given a directive to plan a rescue operation. The SAS planners had begun to work. They had examined the building from imagery. They had examined the surrounding streets. They had calculated the likely routes of entry and exit. They had assessed the number of hostages, the number of guards, the likely location of the hostages within the building. They had calculated the number of personnel that would be needed to assault the building simultaneously, to suppress any defensive fire, to secure the hostages, to provide fire support for the extraction. They had calculated the timing that would minimize civilian casualties while maximizing the probability of a successful rescue. They had rehearsed the operation. The 12-man troop that would conduct the operation had prepared for it. They had done dry runs. They had practiced the assault sequence. They had practiced the hostage extraction procedures. They had practiced the procedures for handling injured hostages and getting them to medical facilities. They were ready. They knew the building from the imagery. They knew the target. They understood the risk. They understood the potential downside if the intelligence was wrong about something critical. If the hostages had been moved, if the building was being used for something other than hostage holding, if the intelligence was stale, and they were prepared to execute the operation and to handle contingencies as they arose. Then, 6 hours before the operation was scheduled to launch, the cabinet cancelled it. The cancellation decision had come from somewhere in the British government's Crisis Management Centre, the place where decisions about Iraq policy were being made at the ministerial level. The reasoning behind the cancellation was actually not irrational, even though the decision would turn out to be wrong in its execution. The British government had become concerned over the previous months about its diplomatic position in Iraq, and particularly its position relative to the United States. The United States was being harshly criticized by human rights organizations and by international media for operations that had resulted in significant civilian casualties. The British government was trying to maintain a position where Britain was seen as a more responsible, more careful, more restrained actor in Iraq. Britain was trying to be the voice for proportionality and for concern for civilian casualties. Britain was trying to maintain that it was the responsible partner, the one that cared about the rules of engagement and about following proper procedures. If Britain were to conduct a hostage rescue operation that turned out to be at the wrong location, resulting in a firefight in a civilian area or casualties among non-combatants, it would compromise that position entirely. The government was concerned about the image of British forces in Iraq and about the political impact if an operation went wrong and resulted in civilian casualties. More than that, if the operation failed in a significant way, if the hostage wasn't there, if the intelligence was wrong about something critical, it would raise questions about how the British government was conducting intelligence operations in Iraq. And those questions would come up in Parliament. And those questions would be embarrassing. And those questions would have to be answered. And in the context of the political position that Britain was trying to maintain on Iraq policy, which was increasingly at odds with American strategy, that kind of embarrassment could have serious consequences. The British government was trying to position itself as more ethical, more careful, more concerned with international law. If a rescue operation went wrong, that entire position could be undermined. The intelligence assessment suggested that there was a significant probability that the hostages had been moved. The captors knew that there was a British rescue operation being planned. They might have moved the hostages as a security measure. If that was the case, then the operation would be a disaster. A raid on an empty building, no hostage rescue, possibly injuries to SAS personnel, definitely embarrassment to the government. Better to cancel. Better to wait for more certain intelligence. Better to think about this more carefully. That was the thinking at the cabinet level. The cancellation order was transmitted through the proper military chain of command. It came from the appropriate governmental authority. It was formatted correctly. It included the reasoning, or at least it included language that justified the decision. and it came with enough advance notice that people could prepare to deal with the reality that a planned operation was no longer happening. The SAS troop commander, a captain who had been preparing for the operation, who had rehearsed it, who understood the intelligence picture, received the message. The message was clear. The operation was cancelled. Stand down. Prepare to reconceive the plan based on revised intelligence. Wait for further orders. Do not proceed with the operation. The message was clear. And the captain who received it faced a problem that was actually more complicated than it appeared on its surface. The problem was this. Task Force Black operations were conducted under a protocol that had been established for operations in denied areas. Once an operation had entered certain phases, once insertion had begun, once the operation was geographically committed, once the force was already moving or already in position, there was a communications protocol that governed how cancellation orders could be transmitted. The protocol existed because the nature of modern military communications meant that a message could be intercepted, corrupted, or misunderstood. It existed because operations on the ground needed to maintain operational security. And maintaining operational security sometimes meant maintaining radio silence or using encrypted communications that couldn't always be interpreted with absolute certainty. And it existed because the people planning operations understood that a cancellation order that arrived with certainty was different from a cancellation order that arrived with some ambiguity about whether it was actually a cancellation or something else. The protocol was not unusual. Similar protocols exist in most militaries. The protocol was designed to prevent a situation where an operation that was geographically committed could be cancelled by a message that arrived with insufficient clarity to be acted upon. It was a safety mechanism. The protocol recognized that in the chaos and noise of military operations, communications were not always crystal clear. The protocol acknowledged that when an operation was underway or about to begin, when soldiers were already moving toward an objective, when the situation was fluid and changing, a cancellation order that arrived in ambiguous form was different from a cancellation order that arrived with absolute clarity. The protocol required that a cancellation order arriving in ambiguous form had to be confirmed and clarified before the operation could actually be terminated. The 12-man SAS troop was already in motion. They had begun their insertion toward the target building. They were on an approach route through the urban terrain of Fallujah. They were moving through the streets with careful tactical procedures, using cover, maintaining fire discipline, moving by bounds to minimize exposure. They were approximately 40 minutes from the target. They were committed to the operation in a physical sense. They were on the ground, they were moving toward the objective, and they could not return to the point of origin without either completing the mission or facing a difficult extraction if they reversed course. The cancellation message, when it reached the troop commander, contained what the SAS would later describe as communication ambiguity. The message was garbled on initial transmission. The radio operators involved relayed what they believed the message contained, but there was not absolute certainty about what the message actually said. There was ambiguity. There was noise on the channel. There was the possibility that something had been missed or misheard. The protocol that governed this situation, the protocol for operations that were already geographically committed and receiving communications that were ambiguous in character, did not require the operation to be cancelled. What the protocol required was that the troop commander make a tactical decision based on the intelligence picture he possessed, the status of the force, and the operational environment. The troop commander was a professional with years of experience in direct action operations. He had planned this operation. He understood the intelligence picture. He understood the risk. He understood the building, the target, the likely position of the hostages. He was aware of the hostages' status. They were alive, they were in captivity, the clock was ticking. Every hour that passed without a rescue operation was an hour in which the hostages were at risk of being executed, of being moved, of being killed if it became clear that no rescue would occur. He made a decision. He would proceed. He would treat the communications ambiguity as requiring clarification, which would take time that the force did not have. He would treat the intelligence picture that he had, which was good intelligence, which had been validated by multiple sources, as the operative intelligence. He would proceed with the operation. And so the SAS troop continued its approach to the target building. The 12 men moved through the streets of Fallujah with weapons ready. They moved with precision, with cover positions, with fire support positions being established as they advanced. They moved with the understanding that they might be about to encounter an armed response from a hostile force that had kidnapped and was holding 2 British nationals. They moved with the discipline that comes from extensive training and repeated rehearsal. And they continued toward the target, knowing that they were operating under communications that might have indicated a cancellation, but knowing also that the intelligence was good and the need was urgent and the decision was theirs to make. They reached the building. They moved into their assault positions. They prepared to make entry. And then, with the information that they had, the good intelligence, the validated sources, the building that was supposed to contain the hostages, they conducted the assault. The building was occupied. The building contained armed personnel, the Zarqawi network operatives who were holding the hostages. The SAS assault went exactly as planned. The building was secured, the armed occupants were neutralized, and the hostages were found. The British journalist was there. His Iraqi interpreter was there. Both were alive. Both were in relatively good condition, given the circumstances of their captivity. The intelligence had been correct. The building was the right building. The hostages were where the intelligence said they would be. The operation was a success. The troops secured the hostages. They began the extraction. They moved the hostages to a secure position. They called for helicopter extraction. Within an hour of the initial assault, the entire force was airborne, moving to a secure location. The operation had taken less than 2 hours from initial assault to extraction complete. No SAS casualties. The hostages rescued. The operation successful. The decision that the cabinet had made to cancel the operation would have prevented the rescue. If the troop commander had obeyed that order, if the operation had been cancelled, the hostages would have remained in captivity or would have been killed. The situation on the ground in Fallujah in December 2004 was fluid and dangerous. The Zarqawi network was actively hunting and eliminating British hostages, journalists, aid workers, and anyone else who was perceived as a foreign presence or a potential propaganda asset. The network had no interest in prolonging hostage situations if it became clear that no ransom would be paid or no concession would be extracted. The network preferred rapid exploitation of hostages, a quick propaganda video, a quick execution, a quick disposal. The 2 hostages, the British journalist and his Iraqi interpreter, were at immediate risk. The intelligence assessment that suggested they might have been moved was not baseless. It was a real possibility. But it was a possibility that had to be weighed against the probability that the intelligence was still current and accurate. The troop commander, in the moment, had to make a decision. Did the probability that the intelligence was still valid outweigh the probability that the hostages had been moved? The intelligence had been good. Multiple sources. It had been corroborated. It had not been stale. It was recent intelligence. The troop commander judged that the probability of the intelligence being accurate was higher than the probability of it being outdated. That judgment was based on his experience, his knowledge of intelligence assessment, his understanding of Zarqawi network security practices, and his judgment was correct. When the operation was complete, the question arose, what did you tell the cabinet? The cabinet had cancelled the operation. The cabinet had made a decision based on an intelligence assessment and a calculation of diplomatic risk. The operation had proceeded anyway. The operation had succeeded in ways that the cabinet's decision would have prevented. How do you report success that came from not following the cancellation order? How do you explain that the troop commander had treated the cancellation as ambiguous and had proceeded with the operation based on different intelligence? How do you not create a political crisis about whether SAS commanders can simply ignore government orders? The answer that came back was elegant. The cabinet was told that the cancellation order had been received after the initial assault on the building had been made. This was technically true. The cancellation had been transmitted as ambiguous communications. The troop commander had made a tactical decision not to be halted by communications that were not unambiguously clear. By the time the cancellation could have been received clearly and unambiguously, the assault was underway. And the statement that the cancellation was received after the initial assault had been made was not a lie. It was a careful framing of timing, and on that basis, the cabinet accepted what had happened. The hostages had been rescued. The operation had been successful. The government had not, technically, failed to follow its own orders. The orders had not been followed because they had not been clearly received before the point at which the operation became irreversible. In the aftermath, nothing was officially said about the communication ambiguity that had allowed the operation to proceed. Nothing was officially said about whether the troop commander had treated the cancellation message as unclear or whether he had simply decided that the intelligence picture was too good to pass up. Nothing was officially said about the protocol that governed geographically committed operations. The operation went into the classified history. The hostages were returned to the United Kingdom. The journalist gave interviews about his captivity. The British government did not explain what had happened or how the rescue had been conducted. The SAS did not release any information about the operation, and the question of whether the cabinet's decision to cancel the operation had been correct, or whether the troop commander's decision to proceed had been correct, remained forever in the realm of classification. But what was clear, what became understood through the entire chain, was that there had been a moment of decision. A moment where an officer with authority, with knowledge of the ground, with understanding of the intelligence, with years of experience in direct action operations, had made a choice. The choice had been to trust his training, his intelligence picture, and his understanding of the situation rather than to trust a cancellation order that had arrived in ambiguous form. And that choice had resulted in 2 people being rescued who would otherwise have remained in captivity or would have been killed. And nobody was going to discipline him for it. Nobody was going to say that he'd overstepped. Nobody was going to create a precedent that SAS commanders who conducted successful operations against orders would face consequences. Instead, there would be a careful silence. A silence that protected the cabinet because it allowed the decision to be reframed. A silence that protected the troop commander because it did not require him to explicitly acknowledge that he'd overridden government orders. A silence that protected the entire system because it did not force anyone to take a public position on whether SAS commanders have the authority to make independent decisions about geographically committed operations. And the operation would become part of regimental memory, a moment when the communications protocol had worked exactly as designed. The communications protocol that had allowed the operation to proceed was not accidental or informal. It was a deliberately crafted procedure that recognized the realities of modern warfare and the specific constraints of special operations. The protocol existed because military commanders understood that in the chaos of operations, especially operations in hostile environments where radio discipline was critical and security was paramount, messages could arrive garbled or incomplete. The protocol existed because military commanders understood that a geographically committed force, a force that was physically moving toward an objective, was in a different state of readiness than a force that was still in preparation. The protocol existed because military commanders understood that sometimes the information available to a field commander in real time, based on what they were actually seeing and hearing, was better and more current than the information available to higher command. The protocol was, in essence, an acknowledgement of the limits of top-down command and control in special operations. It was an acknowledgement that the person closest to the action sometimes knows better than the person far away from the action. What happened in Fallujah on December 17, 2004, was not unique. It was not even unusual. Similar decisions have been made in other operations, by other commanders, in other places where SAS soldiers have been operating behind enemy lines. The difference was that in this case, the operation succeeded in such a manner that the successful outcome made the question of obedience or disobedience secondary. The hostages were rescued. The intelligence had been correct. The operation had been brilliantly executed. The cabinet could accept that the order had been received too late because the operation had succeeded and because acknowledging success was more important than exploring the details of how orders had been processed. But the precedent that was set, that a field commander in possession of good intelligence and clear judgment could proceed with an operation despite communications that suggested it had been cancelled, That precedent would exist in the institutional memory of the regiment and of Task Force Black for years to come. The journalist who was rescued in Fallujah would go on to give interviews and write about his experience. He had been held in captivity for days. He had been subjected to questioning about his reporting, about his intentions, about his connections to Western governments. He had been threatened with execution. He had been in mortal danger. He was aware that hostages in similar situations had been executed. He was aware that his fate was uncertain. When the SAS assault team entered the building and secured him, when they moved him to safety, when they told him that he was being evacuated, he became one of the few people who could testify to the fact that the British government had conducted a military operation to rescue him. He could testify that the rescue had been successful. He could testify that British soldiers had been willing to risk their lives to bring him to safety. What he would not know, and what would never be explained to him, was that the operation that had saved his life was an operation that the British government had cancelled, an operation that should not have proceeded. An operation that had only happened because a young captain in the SAS had decided that the intelligence was good enough and that the need was urgent enough to overcome the ambiguity in a cancellation order. That young captain, and the 12 men under his command, would never receive public recognition for what they had done. The operation would remain classified. The decision would remain classified. But the two people who were rescued would carry with them, for the rest of their lives, the knowledge that British soldiers had been willing to do something that was not officially authorized, something that was not officially sanctioned, something that was not officially supposed to happen in order to bring them to safety. That is a form of recognition that no medal or commendation can provide. The intelligence assessment that had led to the Cabinet's decision to cancel the operation was not baseless. The assessment was based on real information about the Zarqawi network's practices. The assessment was based on the known willingness of the Zarqawi network to move hostages if they perceived a threat. The assessment was based on past experiences where hostage takers had executed hostages when military rescue operations had been attempted. The intelligence assessment was professionally conducted. The assessment was made by experienced intelligence officers who understood the threat environment and who had studied the Zarqawi network extensively. The assessment reflected legitimate concerns about the hostages' safety, but the assessment was also based on uncertainty. The assessment was based on judgment about what the Zarqawi network was likely to do, not on knowledge of what had actually been done. The assessment said that the hostages might have been moved. The assessment did not say that the hostages had definitely been moved. The assessment did not say that the location was wrong. The assessment said that the probability of the location being correct was lower than would be ideal for a military operation. That probability assessment was the basis for the Cabinet's decision to cancel. The troop commander, on the other hand, had access to information that suggested that the probability of the location being correct was higher than Whitehall's assessment suggested. The troop commander had the intelligence report from Task Force Black's source. The troop commander had assessed the reliability of that source over weeks of interactions. The troop commander had access to other intelligence about the Zarqawi network's practices in ways that Whitehall might not have been. The troop commander understood the timing of the intelligence. The troop commander understood how recent the intelligence was. The troop commander understood the specificity of the intelligence. All of this led the troop commander to conclude that the intelligence was solid enough to justify an operation. The troop commander understood the cost of waiting. The troop commander understood that every hour that passed was an hour in which the hostages were at risk. The troop commander understood that waiting for more certain intelligence meant accepting the risk that the hostages would be moved or executed. In the context of that understanding, the troop commander made the decision to proceed. The question of whether the Cabinet's decision to cancel the operation was correct, or whether the troop commander's decision to proceed was correct remains, to this day, unresolved. From the Cabinet's perspective, the operation was risky. The intelligence was not absolutely certain. The probability of success was not guaranteed. The diplomatic consequences of failure would have been serious. Those were all valid considerations. From the operational perspective, the intelligence was good. The troop was ready. The need was urgent. The probability of success given the quality of the intelligence and the training of the soldiers involved was high. Those were valid considerations too. Both perspectives contained truth. Both perspectives contained valid reasoning. But in the end, the decision was made by the people on the ground, in possession of the real-time intelligence and real-time understanding of the situation. And that decision was correct. The hostages were rescued, the intelligence was accurate, the operation was successful. And the British government, rather than admit that it had been wrong to cancel the operation, simply accepted the fiction that the cancellation had been received too late. Everyone involved understood what had actually happened. Everyone involved knew that the cancellation had been ambiguous. Everyone involved knew that the troop commander had made a judgment call. But everyone also understood that questioning that judgment call in the aftermath of a successful operation would be counterproductive. And so the silence was maintained. And the operation became part of history. Classified history, but history nonetheless. What this operation revealed was something fundamental about how the SAS understands its role in the British military system. The SAS exists to accomplish missions that serve national interests. The SAS understands that there are times when those missions cannot be formally authorized, because the formal authorization would create political problems. The SAS understands the value of deniability. The SAS understands the importance of maintaining plausible denial of certain operations. And the SAS understands that sometimes, when the intelligence is good and the need is urgent and the operation is feasible, you proceed even if the communications are ambiguous. You proceed even if the higher authority has expressed doubt. You proceed even if the formal order is to stand down. You proceed because you understand that the people giving the orders are sometimes working with incomplete information, working with political constraints, working with concerns that are not purely operational in nature. And you proceed because you trust your own judgment. You trust your training, you trust your soldiers, and you trust that if you succeed, the people who gave the ambiguous orders will be relieved to have the problem solved, even if they will never explicitly acknowledge the role that you played in solving it. That is the culture of the SAS. That is what allows the SAS to accomplish things that would otherwise be impossible. That is what allows 4-man patrols to survive 11 days without orders. What allows a captain to override a cancellation order? What allows the regiment to continue to conduct operations that are simultaneously necessary for national security and impossible to acknowledge officially? That culture exists because everyone involved understands the rules. Everyone understands that success is what matters, not official acknowledgement. Everyone understands that when you cannot get official authorization for something that needs to be done, you find a way to do it anyway, and you make sure that the outcome is successful enough that the people in the halls of power will have to live with what you have done. The successful hostage rescue in Fallujah revealed something fundamental about how human intelligence collection, when combined with operational flexibility and tactical judgment, could produce results that even the most elaborate institutional intelligence apparatus could not match. The Task Force Black approach relied on personnel who were deeply embedded in the Iraqi network, who had developed relationships with informants over time, who could rapidly act on information when it was available. The American system relied on a broader intelligence apparatus that had to coordinate across multiple agencies, had to validate information through multiple sources, had to ensure that operational decisions met legal and procedural requirements. Both systems had value, but in a situation where time was critical, where the window for action was closing, the Task Force Black system had clear advantages. The human source who had provided information about the hostage location was someone who was in direct contact with the insurgent group. The source had been inside the compound. The source had seen the hostages. The source was able to provide precisely the kind of tactical information that Task Force Black needed in order to execute a rescue operation. By contrast, the American intelligence apparatus, despite its sophistication and its resources, was still several steps removed from that level of specificity. The relationship between Task Force Black and its human sources was built on something different from the traditional intelligence community relationship with agents. Task Force Black sources understood that information they provided would be acted upon quickly. They understood that Task Force Black was willing to take risks based on the information they provided. They understood that Task Force Black valued speed over bureaucratic procedure. This understanding meant that sources were more likely to provide information to Task Force Black than to provide the same information to the traditional intelligence community. The source who provided information about the hostage location had come forward because he understood that Task Force Black could act on that information. He understood that Task Force Black would not spend weeks validating his information through multiple channels. He understood that Task Force Black would move quickly, and that speed had made the difference between a successful rescue and a situation in which the hostages remained in captivity or were killed. The fundamental tension that emerged from the Fallujah operation was the tension between the desire for certainty in the intelligence picture and the necessity of acting quickly when circumstances demanded action. The American system, with all its resources and all its sophisticated intelligence collection capabilities, was designed to achieve certainty. The American system required multiple sources corroborating the same information before action could be authorized. The American system required approval from multiple levels of command before an operation could be launched. The American system required risk assessments that assigned probability estimates to various outcomes. The American system was designed to minimize the risk of operational failure by insisting on a high degree of certainty before committing resources. And the Task Force Black system, by contrast, was designed to achieve speed. Task Force Black was willing to act on intelligence that was solid but not absolutely certain. Task Force Black had the authority to make operational decisions without requiring approval from higher command. Task Force Black understood that in a time-sensitive situation, the cost of delay could be measured in human lives. Task Force Black was willing to accept higher operational risk in exchange for faster action. Both approaches made sense in their own contexts. But when the two approaches came into conflict, when the American system said no and the Task Force Black system said yes, the outcome demonstrated that in a time-sensitive situation, the faster approach had clear advantages. The hostages lived because the faster approach was taken. The hostages would likely have died if the more cautious, more deliberate approach had been followed to its conclusion. After the operation was complete, after the hostages were safely returned to the United Kingdom, after the government had accepted the carefully constructed fiction that the cancellation had been received too late, life continued as normal. The 12 SAS soldiers returned to their bases. The journalist began writing about his experience. The government conducted an internal review of what had happened, but the review remained classified. No one was disciplined, no one was reprimanded, no one was even formally questioned about the decision to proceed with the operation despite the ambiguous cancellation order. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the operation had been successful. And that success was what mattered. The troop commander went on to conduct other operations. Some would be successful, some would be more complicated. But this operation that had been cancelled and then uncancelled, this operation that had been controversial in the halls of power, this operation would stand as a perfect example of how to conduct a hostage rescue in circumstances of extreme difficulty and high risk. The technical execution was flawless. The intelligence assessment was correct. The intelligence handling was excellent. The assault was quick and professional. The hostages were secured. The extraction was clean. Everything that could have gone wrong stayed right. And the operation succeeded because the soldiers on the ground trusted their judgment more than they trusted the ambiguous cancellation order. And that is the final truth of this operation. It succeeded because a young captain and the 12 men under his command made a decision to trust their training, their intelligence, and their own judgment about what needed to be done in a moment of urgency and ambiguity. And that decision produced an outcome that served national interests and saved 2 lives. The British government never held a press conference to celebrate. The Ministry of Defence never published a citation. No medals were announced in the London Gazette, no photograph released to the press, no handshake at Buckingham Palace. The 12 men slipped back into the anonymity that defines special operations. They ate in the same canteen, filed the same paperwork, drew the same pay, but in the quiet confidence of their own professional knowledge, and in the shared understanding of what they had actually done and why, Those 12 men carried something that no institutional silence could take from them. They had looked at an ambiguous cancellation and decided that 2 lives weighed more than a disputed communications window. They had been right. And in the world the SAS inhabits, a world where being right quietly and without acknowledgement is the entire point, that was enough.